that title looks a little different, doesn't it? I think today what we're going to be talking about is, kind of summed up in "I have sinned," and that was a quote from Saul to Samuel, and he says that a couple times. Yesterday, a couple came up to me and talked. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about when Samuel preaches in 1 Samuel 12 to the children of Israel about the storms that came up that Samuel called down, the wind and the rain. And of course it was wheat harvest, and wheat that's laying down would certainly not be harvestable easily. And I thought that was interesting. Two different people came up to me. The scriptures are just rich with, you could go on and on of all the things. So again, you think about what could have happened into their food supply. We talk a lot about that now with Ukraine and how it's affecting the world. Something like that. Of course, we're causing mankind. Of course, I think we cause most of the problems that we have, or at least I can speak for myself. So what we covered, and I don't want to spend a ton of time here because we have hopefully a lot to cover today, but in class 1, for those who are just joining, we talked a little bit about the history of the Benjamites, which I found fascinating when I became curious when I started to look at Saul itself. What was his upbringing? What was his background? Did God set him up for success and making him king? Kind of a dumb question to ask, but again, just trying to ask why. Why the things happened to Saul that happened to Saul after you read through that. And so what might influence his upbringing? For those who know Judges 19 through 21, it's a terrible scene. It's the Sodom and Gomorrah of Israel, where all the women of Benjamin were literally killed. Most of the men were killed. There was only a few, 600 men, I think, left. And of course, Saul being a Benjamite, my first question was, would that affect them? And of course, that happened 240 years before Saul would have come onto the scene, Kish and Saul's father. And then we talked a little bit about, did Saul and Kish, did they go for the yearly worship? And, my best speculation is that they didn't necessarily follow, like the example that Elkanah and Hannah did, Samuel's parents, where they went up I love that story. When I was studying this and trying to understand some of that history, I have a couple of good exhortations that I haven't given yet that are about them, because it's such a wonderful thing that, she travels, after they travel year to year, she continues to travel and bring Samuel a new suit, right? So he's growing up, so he's got to have a new suit all the time. Just wonderful the way that Samuel, and again, most of us can look at our life and we've had good or bad experiences in our upbringing. I happen to be one to say that I have a really good upbringing with my entire family. I'm always in awe of those who come in from the outside because I draw great energy from them. I grew up around going to meeting and the truths as we know them. So I probably am that pastor's child that was more rebellious and asking questions and why and how can so many people be wrong in my growing up. I don't know if anybody else did that. But I think if I was to retitle this whole study, it would be more of how wonderful God is. And I think the entire week is proving that out by all the speakers, how wonderful God is and how He cares for us. And the entire scriptures are written for truly our learning. I think if there's anything that would come out in that. And as we go through this, while we have players in there, it is about God. I mean, God is the one that's bringing this about. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the battle at Jabesh Gilead. And again, we kind of see there's a lot going on there where Saul comes we're going to go back and look at a few verses there, but he prophesies. He really seems to have it together at that point. And there's a couple times that he seems to turn around and he just can't sustain it. Anybody else find that challenge in certain things that they do? We'll see that again today. In Samuel, and this is something, when you go through chapter 12, when he's preaching to the people there, kind of his last big speech, he was still very active after that, but I think he talks about so many things in there. I mean, it's all the basics that we need in our own upbringing, and I think throughout the scriptures it's that way. So meanwhile, I said I was going to spend much time on it, but I did, didn't I? So the whole story fascinates me. Oh, that was my wife said the loudest. So that's the encouragement I've been getting for months, obviously. And it's been very helpful. I can honestly say that. I don't remember what guy called his lovely bride yesterday, but it was very nice. His treasure, right? So Cindy would probably love to hear those things from time to time. So honey, I'm learning. Guys, teaching. Honey or my treasure. She's laughing. She didn't buy that for 1 second. Obviously, it didn't sound very sincere, right? So maybe we're a little bit of Saul in here teaching you today. So we're going to look at two things, and I have a lot of the scriptures up here, and I know I don't need to read the scriptures to you. Try to summarize the stories, and as I was going through this yesterday and kind of restructuring things, I put a lot of the verses in there for those who like to see that. I had a few people say, hey, I like to see the verses, but you know, the battle with the Amalekites, what's interesting about these two different stories is the first one, you're not 100% sure if you read that close that how he got the instruction that he had to wait the 7 days, why did he go to Gilgal, you know, what was the instructions, but we see that Samuel said, you know, that was instruction from the Lord, but it's not necessarily clear anywhere, and hopefully I would like to come back and show you that. And then with the battle with the Amalekites, it couldn't be clearer. God said this from Samuel to Saul, go do this, and of course it's minutes later that he doesn't do it completely as he was instructed. And I think that's ultimately, and we see, and again, and I put up, I have sinned, I have transgressed, please pardon my sin. And I believe the one time that he says this, he's very sincere, and it seems like he turns. And there's a couple words in there that I had to look up. And so anyhow, and then the one that strikes me most, if you read through Samuel's life, is when he kills Agag. And I am just fascinated by that because we don't really see, there was a very peaceful time, and we read that early on with the Philistines. But the Philistines, and I don't know how anybody else feels, but they were there in their face all that time with Samuel. I mean, we see even in some of their towns they had garrisons there, but they didn't seem to be aroused to come and battle. So, with that, we'll start with the Philistines are lined up on the mountain, and you can just get the picture. I actually went and looked for anybody see the movie Troy? Troy is what is it? It's not Rome, is it? I'm trying to think of the city, but the pictures there is what I was going for, and because they have this image of this massive army lined up, and just you know, you can just imagine Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines, and that's really what started. The Philistines heard of it. And then, of course, with that aroused them up to start gathering, and Saul blows the trumpet to call the Hebrews together. So now all Israel heard it, and that Saul had attacked the garrison of the Philistines. It was actually Jonathan, as we know by reading it. And the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. Why Gilgal? Interesting, we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is, and I'm sure I don't know how to say this right. I listened to it a bunch of times on my computer, and I still can't say it. Mishmash. Like what's the silent one? What would you say?
Mikmash.
Mikmash. Okay. It's exactly how it sounded on the computer. Obviously, I couldn't remember nothing. So anyhow, so they're encamped, and you think about, and I don't even know how to imagine 30,000 chariots lined up, 6,000 horsemen, and it says fighters as the sand of the seashore. Now that would intimidate anybody. Even the greatest of generals would be overwhelmed. Of course, God, being the ultimate general, wouldn't intimidate them all. We've seen him deal with armies of many sizes, and what does he do? He stirs them up, they kill each other, and it's all done, right? So he thunders and scares them away. But as a human being, very, very scary. And these are the images from the movie Troy that I found. As best as, and again, I was actually looking, this is not real, these aren't real people in here. There's a lot of fancy movie stuff they're doing, believe it or not. But anyhow, so this image of just this massive army, and of course we only see a few chariots. Can you imagine 30,000 chariots, which means there would be horsemen there, and again, the best picture I could have of horsemen. And just think of them being, on the mountainside, just there ready to pounce on Israel. So obviously they call them up, and this really doesn't even, this picture doesn't even do it justice. I couldn't find a picture that would make, to kind of get us in that place. So, obviously, the scriptures bear that out. It says, when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, the people hid in caves, in thickets, and rocks, and holes, in pits. And some of the Hebrews even ran, because if you see where Gilgal is, right on the edge of the Jordan, they fled across the Jordan and went over. So this is Saul's army fleeing, the people. These are the fighting men that are fleeing and running from Gilgal, just at the sheer intimidation. And I tried to find, and I don't know if anybody's been over there, I tried to find some images of, can you see where they're located from Gilgal? I don't think so. It was quite a distance from there. But again, what I want you to question in your mind is, why Gilgal? Why Gilgal? Why would they go there? Right, so if we remember, we talked about it on the first day, for those who were here, Shiloh was the first place God put his name, and we can find that in Jeremiah 7. And so we'll look a little bit at this as to why. And again, Samuel says to Saul, God told you to go there. And where did he tell him to go there? So Saul was to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days for Samuel. So 7 obviously is used a lot, 3 is used a lot. There's a lot of numbers that are used many times in the scriptures. And have you ever seen verse 7.5 before? So here's in our talks today, to what Brother John was saying, here's where that continuous improvement guy that put all those chapters and verses in, you will miss that God told him if you only read the chapter 10. And I think that's the fantastic part of it. So anyhow, turn to 13:7.5. So I'm really breaking them down further. Sorry, John. Just had to do that. So as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal. The people followed him trembling. Now I can imagine trembling. Right? Because I think, and the best as I can say, all during Samuel's life, there were no major battles of any kind. So it would have been years that they would have had to necessarily fight. Now, at least I couldn't find any. Maybe somebody else could correct me at a break. Don't yell at me here because I cry easy, just so you know. So then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, right? So there's set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So just picture being Saul. You're the captain of the army. The people are running off. Literally, you can see he's down to 600 men, and he's got this mighty army, just 30,000 chariots, and only 600 men. How would you feel? Think about that for a minute. It'd be pretty scary, right? Again, as a human being, it would be very scary if you didn't rely on God, right? And I think that's sometimes the biggest challenge we have. How many times that, you see this great power come down from God, and then 5 minutes later, I'm afraid of somebody else, right? And I think that's the human challenges that we face. Anyhow, so the people are scattered from him. So Saul brings a burnt offering and a peace offering here, and he offered the burnt offering. So the question for me was, in light of this, and we'll look a little bit deeper at this, but was there anything wrong with him offering to do the offering? I don't have a good answer for that, but what I did was I looked back, and you can see that there's 3 places where people that are not, and so the Levites, the priests and the Levites would have been responsible, right, under the law, to conduct that. But we'll see many times, and I only just picked a couple, not that there's a ton of these, by the way, but Abraham offered burnt offerings, and of course that would have been before the law. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, the same thing that's spoken about here. And then Job actually does a burnt offering. Don't know much about his background, whether he was a priest, maybe somebody who studied that a lot more can. So I question a little bit of, was he wrong for doing a burnt offering? Because later on he does, and he doesn't seem to get in trouble, but maybe he's too far gone when he actually builds his first altar and does that. So, now, he was told to wait 7 days by Samuel at Gilgal, and this is something that's very interesting because I think it sets a pattern that God did for Saul so he could go and find out. He could inquire of Samuel on what he was supposed to do. We'll look at that in a minute. But now it happened, as soon as he finished presenting the burnt offering, guess who shows up? Samuel. Right? And so Saul went out to meet him and to greet him, and to me, at least when I read this, I get this sense that he's just all excited that Samuel's here, not thinking about what he just did. And I'm not 100% sure of that, but I read all the different versions and it just feels that way. So Samuel says to him, and again, God speaks to Samuel. We know that. We can see that through. He says, and Samuel said, while he's coming up and greeting him and seems excited, Samuel says to him, "What have you done?" Maybe that should have been the title, because that fits very well as well. Yeah. And Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered, right? So what do we do when we get in trouble? Was anybody here ever a kid? Oh, Brad was, okay. Anyhow, so, as a kid, what do they start doing? I've seen a few kids that will go, "I was wrong. You're right, Mom and Dad, I was wrong." Not me. I could come up with stories that you couldn't even imagine. Of course, I'm looking at my mom. She can see right through that I was full of it. But so Saul said, "I saw the people, and they were scattered, and that you did not come within the days appointed," but he did, didn't he? So it almost seems like he did it at the 7.5 day, didn't wait the full day. I'm not 100% sure, it doesn't give us that. And that the Philistines gathered together, right? So here's this mighty army that were gathered together, and so you can just imagine him potentially telling this in a somewhat emotional way. "Then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord." So it appears as if he knows that he should do that. So therefore, I felt compelled to offer a burnt offering. So think about that for a minute. Put yourself in Saul's shoes. All these things are happening. There's a mighty army. You're down to 600 men. You believe that you need to worship the Lord before you go. And so I did it. No excuse though, is it? Right? And so it makes us think about in our lives, how many times do we do that? Right? We're so eager to get this done, and we want to go do this, and we haven't inquired of the Lord ourselves. I can tell you many stories of me in my life that, I start asking afterwards, should I have done this? After I already started, so maybe some of you have done that as well. So here's the part I want to talk a little bit about. There's two things. Saul fails here. And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God." And again, that's the part that really was sort of that, like, where did God tell him that? Where did God tell him not to do that? Where did God tell him to go to Gilgal? Which he commanded you. So we know he did, right? But where did he tell him? And God's not going to set somebody up for failure and whisper it so he can't hear it, right? So he says it loud and clear. And we'll look at that. It says, "For now the Lord would have established your kingdom of Israel forever." So start thinking about now what he's hearing, right? So Saul, I am kind of, what this tells me a lot about Saul. I said to Cindy early on, one of the things that struck me about him, he's a very determined person. You ever meet people like that? Right? Sometimes I am so determined to do something that I laugh at myself because there's like all these obstacles that come in the way, but I'll just keep climbing over the rocks and digging underneath and do stuff, and I just, it can't be more clear, I shouldn't go that direction. And this is what it feels like for Saul. So he would have been set up, the kingdom would have been established, it says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after, and again, think about how you might feel if you were Saul. A man after his own heart. The Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. So let's look at that for a minute. Where did he command him? And this is where the chapter and verse separation. So if you have your Bibles out and you look at 1 Samuel 9, at the very end, in verse 27. And so the story there is Saul just met Samuel. He invites him to the feast and feeds him. Right, so Saul tells him verbally, "You are the one that Israel's seeking. You're going to be the king." And he takes him through all these things, and then he tells him to wait there. Send your servant on, and I will give you instructions. So again, 9:27, and this is where again, if you're don't look back here. It says, they were going down to the outskirts of the city. Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go ahead of us." And he went on, "But you stand here a while, that I may announce to you the word of God." There it is. Right? And then so you go on and you look at all the things that he was instructing them. That's what we were talking a little bit about yesterday. He prophesies. That's where that quote came from. It was they were amazed at his prophesying Saul's, whose father is he? Remember, we talked a little bit about that. And so verse 8, here's the instruction. We know it's from God because, again, this continues on. "You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and surely," 1 Samuel 10:8, to Gilgal, "and surely I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings." I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So that, in my mind, speaks volumes to Saul. That he has a prophet, and it's Samuel, and that and again, if you read that whole section, and I've probably read it so many times I could almost recite it, is that the verses before almost are like, if you have occasion, when you're facing a challenge, go to Gilgal. I'll go meet you there. We'll do sacrifice of peace offerings, and then God, through me, will share what you should do. That's the way that it feels in that reading there. So, and again, and I put verse 9 in there only so it shows when he turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass, and that was all the things that Samuel prophesied happened to him. Again, more teaching from God. Everything, all those, you just think about, hey, go over here, you're going to run into some people, then these people are going to be coming down playing music, and go with them, and all the things that, it's sort of like that. There can't be any clearer signs. This is from God. God is setting this up. Obviously, Samuel couldn't have arranged it. They couldn't go on the cell phone and say, okay, he's about there. All right, now come down the hill, right? I mean, it's just, all those things had to be directed from God. So here's where he's told to go to Gilgal, and I think this is for a good reason, right? So, they're spread out, they're not necessarily far apart. When you find occasion, as it says, and you can look at that, and certainly I would love to get anybody's feedback on that, but that whole story is God instructing Saul through Samuel, and that's where that comes from. That's why he knew better. So think about that, and we read our scriptures and we have plenty of instruction, and I'm sure nobody in this room has ever done anything wrong other than me. So he goes, why it was unlawful, God made it clear instructions to go to Gilgal as occasion arises. And again, I think if you read that over and over again, no matter what version you read, it's like when these things arise, wait 7 days, Samuel will come, offer sacrifices, tell you what you should do. God's guidance will be there. No fear, even in the worst of situations. Well, they haven't faced that. They had already battled at Jabesh Gilead, right? So they've had an example of God being with them and quickly taking down the enemy. Really, within 1 day, he takes down the enemy. As far as I can tell, that happened before this. This is where the timelines get very confusing. when was David and Goliath. And, there's so many stories of Saul. Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, correct? Of course, that all happens at the battle that Saul is there, right? So all these stories, they interact. Samuel, Saul, and David, and it's really wonderful how God works that together to make a transition, right? So oftentimes, like in anything, even when David was made king, he didn't take over everything, right? There was a transition time for anybody who studied that. We're reading in 2 Samuel right now. So he, just in summary, he knew better, correct? He knew not to do the sacrifices, that he was to wait for Samuel, and that he would get instructions. Then he would have known what to do, to gather his army back, how to gather them together, was God with them? All those things would have come out, and again, he didn't wait. He was impatient, determined, and that's sort of a human trait that we all face, I'm sure. So now here, this story is a little bit different. I'm not sure what's done.
You're okay. We start a little late. You get till like 9:35.
Okay. Should follow the lead of setting a timer up here, then I would know. That's an issue. What's that? The big S is still around? The 5?
Yes.
Okay. So here, when God, and this whole story is fascinating because when God sends Saul to do something to kill the Amalekites, this was something that he was waiting some 450 to 500 years ago, is when they were coming down through, when they were in the wilderness and when they were coming in, and how the Amalekites treated them. And we'll look at that a little bit. And so this would be very important to God, wouldn't it? I mean, he said he was going to do this, and now was the time. He has his general, he's got his armies, and he's going to go take care of the Amalekites for what they did to his children. So God doesn't forget either. That's something we certainly should all remember. Or he's not going to relent. I love the story about Tyre when he said, I'm going to scrape the rocks clean. And to me, of course, I would have went over there and scraped them all clean. He waits 250 years and then he does it, right? So, these stories, it's the patience of God, and the timing is obviously not our time. So, in this case, the instructions are clear for us, at least, and clear for Saul. Samuel is telling him what to do. And if you, again, while I didn't spend a lot of time with this, they are also, he's getting this instruction. Anyhow, they're very clear. The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, heed the voice of the Lord, and thus says the Lord of hosts. So Samuel's going to tell him what to do. He's very clear. I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way that he came, when he came up from Egypt. So it was very clear, I'm going to repay them for what they did. Now, nobody alive of the Amalekites would have been involved in that, correct? There's nobody 400 years old, I wouldn't think. You're not sure, thinking about it. Right, again, when God punishes them, it's long after, it's the several generations later. Assuming I have my timing right. So now, go attack Amalek and utterly destroy them and all that they have, and do not spare them. Clear, right? We know from history, and they would have known from verbal, God has given that instructions when they came into the land several times, right? And all they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That's probably everything they have. Don't take anything. Correct? So there couldn't be any clearer instructions than that. So Deuteronomy 17, when Moses writes this, it says 25:17 over there on the whatever side it is. Anyhow, so remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt. and how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore, it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. That's God. Nothing clearer than that, right? I mean, that was written some 500 years prior to him actually doing it. So, and the only reason I stress all this is because I don't think there's a more important mission that it's important to God, let's put it this way, that he's going to finally take care of what he said he was going to do a long time ago. So did God need Saul to do that? No. But he said that he was going to have them do that, right? God could have just turned off the air in their area and they would all died and that would have been it, or however you do that. So again, he doesn't need us, but we're part of his plan and purpose, right? And so that's why we're here. So how does Saul do with those instructions? Most of us have read the story. It says, and what's really interesting about this whole story is there's only a little bit about the battle. So obviously the battle is unimportant. It's what happens before and after that is most important. Because the battle is like only a few words, really. So it says that Saul attacked the Amalekites, and he also, verse 8, and he also took Agag, and so this is the beginning of it, right? Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So you would think if you read that part, he was doing pretty good, correct? Yeah, maybe not. Then verse 9 says, but Saul and the people spared Agag, the best of the sheep, oxen, fatlings, lambs, all that was good, right? So all that was pleasing in our sight. And they were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, okay, that's justification for us, right? Everything that was bad, we got rid of that, we killed it. Got rid of it. So right away, we don't know much about the battle, other than Saul attacked the Amalekites. The rest is Saul failed. He didn't live up to the instructions. This was really important to God. And then what happens? So has anybody here ever given instructions that somebody didn't follow? Probably not. The only one in the world that's had that happen to, right? So you get frustrated. And so as a manager of people and leading some businesses where I had a lot of people working for me, I used to get very angry when I said, okay, go do this, and then they didn't do that. And so for a long time I thought there was something wrong with them. But what I really believe in human-to-human interactions, a little bit different between God, is a lot of times I start speaking, they build a picture in their mind, I have a picture in my mind, and they're two different pictures. It doesn't happen that way with God anywhere that I see. He makes it very clear to us, but when we are human to human, it happens. So a lot of times I believe today, instead of getting frustrated with the other person, they probably got this picture that was different than mine, and they went off and did exactly what they thought we were going to go do. And so whether that's 100% true or not, most people won't defy you. But in this case, God is very clear. So right after that, now the word of the Lord came to Samuel. God was quick to give it to Samuel, right? And he says, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandment. I mean, it couldn't be any faster. He's watching and he speaks right to Samuel right away. That's the picture I get. I don't know if it happened that fast, but and then it grieves Samuel because my sense throughout all this thing, and even and again, we won't talk about that today, but in chapter 16 is the verse I started off with, where God says to Samuel, "Why do you keep mourning over Saul. I rejected him. Let's get on and go select David and move on, right? So that whole beginning of chapter 1. I really believe Samuel had a special place, just the way he talked for Saul throughout that. And he was truly grieved. I think he was grieved that they failed, but I think he was grieved for Saul, my best guessing. He grieved Samuel, and he cried out loud to the Lord all night. And the Lord spoke to him, because we'll see. So when Samuel rose early in the morning, and I always think of, what does God say when he talks about the prophets? I got up early in the morning, I sent people to you, I kept instructing you, I was trying to get you to turn. I got up early in the morning is the term that's used. And here, very similar, Samuel rises early in the morning to go meet Saul. And it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument for himself. And again, that's an interesting story. So I won't spend any time on that, but you could just picture. I've seen, a monument. I don't think they carved this picture out of a rock. I mean, it's almost like they stuck these rocks together, is what people think. And maybe somebody studied that further. I have not. So anyhow, so he monumented himself, and this is again. He heard about this, and he has gone on around and passed by and gone down to Gilgal. So he's returning back to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and this is the part that it's like the little kid that my mom used to say about me. Me and the neighbor boys would be doing something wrong, and I'm coming home, and I go walk in, and then she tells the story the best. I come walking in the door with a big smile on my face, and she's hanging up the phone. My friend's mom just called her, right? So my mom would say my face would fall down right away because I knew what we just did. So that that's sort of the picture here, right? So then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." Right? So he goes walking in to Samuel thinking, "I did all these things." Do you think he really didn't know that he failed? That's probably the speculation side, but it really feels like he knew. He knew what he should be doing. Again, another failure. He didn't follow what he was supposed to do. And that's the lesson for us. And again, to me, I think of children, I think of myself being a child. So if my mom was here, she'd be rolling her eyes, thinking of all the things that she remembers me doing like that, right? So, and then Samuel's comment to him, which I love this, he said, after Samuel said that, I've done all the commands, and what does Samuel say to him? What's that noise I hear? Right? All these animals making noise, and sheep in my ears, and the oxen, and right? So he knows right away he didn't. You just have to listen to him, right? So that's the best image I could come up with. I'm sure there was a lot more people around, but it is sort of, you get the picture. So Samuel's very firm and direct. How much time do we have left? I don't know. 5, okay. Samuel's very firm and direct with him and shares what God told him. And I think, again, you don't need me to tell you this, but Samuel says to Saul, "Be quiet. You're full of it in my mind. You knew what to do. And I'll tell you what the Lord said to me last night," right? So he spent the night with the Lord. He was tossing and turning. Well, he got up early in the morning. And again, you love the little stories of Samuel when God first started speaking to him. And he got up and he'd go to Eli and say, "What did you call me?" Right? So God spoke to Samuel from very early on. So anyhow, it was so Samuel said to him, this is a good one, "When you were little in your own eyes, and you were not head of the tribes of Israel, and did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel like you were nobody? And that the Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners of the Amalekites and fight against them until they are consumed'? Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you not swoop down on why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" I really think this is an emotional point for Samuel. Not only did he defy God, Samuel told him all this. He would have known better. So, and this is the part that's written throughout the scripture, right? "As the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat ones of the rams," right? So he's told it, right? "I desire mercy as opposed to sacrifice." It's said many ways throughout the scriptures. What does God want? For rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is is as iniquity of idolatry. I mean, he lays that out pretty clear, right? So stubbornness, determination, doing your own thing. So then, and again, I'll leave you with this. Saul says to Samuel, I have sinned, I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord. And when you read through this, you get the sense that that he really was sincere. He said, because I feared the people and obeyed their voices, and I'm not sure that's the case, but that's not another child telling their story. But now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. And as you go down through there, he actually, well, let's just go quick, right? So then he says that Samuel turned around to go away. Saul seized the edge of his robe, and of course then Saul turns to him and said, your kingdom has been torn from you. And you just get this picture of Saul begging him. And actually Samuel turns around, and this is the part that we haven't seen out of Samuel at all. He kills Agag. Not only does he kill him, he chops him up, is the way it says, right? So Agag came to him cautiously. You can imagine being Agag. And surely the bitterness of death is past, Agag says to him. And Samuel said, as the sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag, and that's exactly, as best I understand that word, it's what he did. So he carried out to the king what God asked. Because actually, if you read that, he turns around and he goes back and he does this. So then Samuel went home, and again, we'll leave it here. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul. And this is the part, if you go where the chapter and verse divisions are, right after this, he says to Samuel, why are you doing this? And I don't have that up there. So tomorrow, I want to look at Saul's final battle. John talked a little bit about that with the witch at Endor, and he goes to see her. I want to talk about a little bit about his end of his life. And again, the rescue of his body, because the Philistines had a temple. It is really amazing how close that city is to where they were killed. So it gives you the picture that the Philistines were all intertwined. And the summary, some of the encounters with David, I want to try to talk a little bit about those because I think God is preaching to Saul continuing. And then what do we take away from what we studied? Thank you.